When I married Ethan, I didn't think I'd ever find myself sitting in a cafe, stirring an untouched cup of coffee, wondering if I could piece together where it all went wrong. At 27, I was head over heels for the boy I'd known since high school. He had this easy charm, the kind that made strangers want to chat and old friends keep coming back. But Ethan wasn't just the life of the party, he was my anchor, the one who always made me feel like I was the most important person in the room. That was before. Now, I'm 30, and I can't say when the distance started. Maybe it was the trips to my parents' house. I'd grown up in a small town, a world away from the buzz of our city life, and Ethan always seemed happy to tag along. When work got busier for me, I'd suggest he go without me. Catch up with everyone, I'd say. You love the quiet out there. And he did. Ethan loved the slow mornings on the porch, my mom's pies, and even the overgrown trails behind their house where he'd go running. What I didn't know was that those trips had become more than a getaway. It started with his childhood friend, Mallory. She'd been in his life longer than I had, long before me, even before his teenage crushes. They grew up in neighboring houses and had the kind of bond built on scraped knees and shared bikes. She moved back to town 3 years ago after her divorce. I'd only met her a handful of times, and she seemed nice enough, though her laugh lingered a little too long, and her eyes sparkled when she looked at Ethan. I think she just misses her old friends, I told myself when I saw him texting her sometimes late into the night. He'd look up, smile at me, and say, "It's Mallory. She's dealing with some stuff. You know how tough that divorce was on her." I nodded, kissed him goodnight, and didn't think twice. That was my first mistake. My second was trusting him completely. 3 years ago, on one of his solo trips, I caught a glimpse of something I wasn't supposed to see. I'd been folding laundry in our bedroom when his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Normally, I'd have ignored it, but something, curiosity, maybe intuition, made me glance at the screen. It was a text from Mallory. "Wish you were still here. Last night was unforgettable. Red heart." I stared at it, frozen. My first thought wasn't anger but confusion. What had happened? Ethan had said he'd stayed at my parents' house the whole weekend. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling, and scrolled up to see more. But the messages above it had been deleted. When he walked through the door that evening, I didn't confront him right away. I wanted to believe there was a logical explanation. Maybe she'd meant something innocent. Maybe there was nothing to worry about. But the unease settled in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. For weeks, I became a stranger in my own life, smiling and laughing on the surface while quietly unraveling inside. Every time Ethan kissed me goodbye or smiled at me over dinner, I wondered, was it real? Or was I just another chapter in a story he was rewriting with her? The answer came one Friday evening. He was out, supposedly with friends, but when I called his best friend Michael to ask when Ethan would be back, Michael paused before saying, I think he mentioned he was heading out of town this weekend." Out of town? I didn't need to ask where. I don't remember how long I sat there with Michael's words echoing in my head. Out of town. It wasn't a slip, Ethan had lied. My stomach churned as I pictured him, bags packed, driving out to that sleepy little town where Mallory waited for him. I told myself I wouldn't jump to conclusions. But the pieces were stacking up like a puzzle, one I didn't want to finish. I decided I'd wait until he got home. Maybe I could catch the truth in his eyes before he wrapped it in more lies. When Ethan walked through the door late Sunday night, looking tired but not particularly guilty, I forced myself to stay calm. He kissed my cheek, smelling faintly of soap and pine, and mumbled something about the drive being long. I didn't push him then, I couldn't. Instead, I stayed up after he went to bed, staring at the blank notes app on my phone, wondering what I could say that would open the door without blowing it off its hinges. The following week, I tried to gather the courage to confront him. But every time I opened my mouth, he'd smile or crack a joke, and the words would wither in my throat. I started watching him more closely instead. Little things. The way he'd leave the room to answer calls. The new cologne on his dresser. The guarded look in his eyes when he caught me glancing his way. And then there was Mallory. Her name came up more often now, slipped into casual conversations. Mallory said the new coffee shop downtown is amazing, or Mallory's thinking of adopting a dog. She asked if I had any tips. He said her name like a memory he was savoring, and every time he did, I felt a crack splinter deeper in my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. So, one evening, when he was in the shower, I did what I swore I'd never do. I picked up his phone. It wasn't locked, he never locked it, and that small, trusting detail made my chest ache. The messages were clean, just like before. Deleted. But when I opened his photo gallery, I found them, pictures of a hiking trail I didn't recognize. The same trail my parents had mentioned when they told me Ethan and Mallory had gone hiking together months ago. I swiped, and my breath caught. There she was, standing by the trail's edge, smiling in the golden hour light. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at him. The last photo was worse. It wasn't a selfie. It wasn't even posed. Ethan had taken it in secret, a candid shot of Mallory sitting on a rock, her head tilted back in laughter. I could almost hear her laugh, the one that lingered too long. And for the first time, I knew. I didn't just suspect. I knew. He loved her. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay next to him, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd ever looked at me the way he looked at her. When I finally closed my eyes, I dreamed of them, together in the woods, their hands brushing as they walked, their laughter echoing off the trees. When I finally confronted Ethan, it was a Tuesday. I remember that because it rained all day, and the gray sky matched the knot in my stomach. He'd just come home from work, kicking off his shoes in the hallway, when I blurted it out. "Are you in love with Mallory?" The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. Ethan froze, one shoe half off, his eyes darting to mine. For a moment, I thought he might deny it. But then his shoulders sagged, and he let out a long, shaky breath. "I don't know," he said quietly. Those 3 words shattered everything. I felt my chest tighten, my lungs struggling for air. "You don't know?" My voice cracked, sharp and brittle. "How can you not know?" He finally looked at me, and the guilt in his eyes was unbearable. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said. She was, he stopped, running a hand through his hair. "It just happened, okay? It wasn't supposed to be anything. But then it was." I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. "How long?" He hesitated. That was answer enough. 3 years, he admitted softly. "It started the first time I went to visit your parents without you. I ran into her at the diner. We just talked. I thought it was harmless." "Harmless?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Ethan, you slept with her." He flinched, but he didn't deny it. "I'm sorry," he said, and for a moment, he looked like the Ethan I'd fallen in love with, the one who would never hurt me, never lie. But that Ethan was a memory now, a ghost of the man standing before me. "Do you love her?" I asked again, quieter this time. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence between us was deafening. He stood there, the man I thought I knew better than anyone, and he couldn't even answer me. My heart felt like it was cracking, piece by piece, with every second that passed. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling, "if you love her, why are you still here?" He sat down on the edge of the couch, burying his face in his hands. "Because I don't know what I want." I clenched my fists, anger bubbling beneath the ache in my chest. "You don't know? You've been carrying on with her for 3 years, and you don't know what you want?" His head snapped up, his face pale. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said. "It was just easier with her. You've been so busy, so wrapped up in work." He stopped, realizing too late that his words were a landmine. I laughed, but it wasn't a sound of humor. It was hollow, bitter. "So this is my fault?" Because I work too much? Because I trusted you enough to let you visit my parents without worrying you'd betray me? That's not what I meant, he said quickly. I'm not blaming you. I'm trying to explain how I got here. And where is that, Ethan? What exactly did you think would happen? You'd keep lying to me, sneaking around, while I smiled and cooked dinner like nothing was wrong? I never wanted to hurt you. His voice was barely a whisper now, and he sounded like a man who was desperate to believe his own lie. Well, congratulations, I said, each word sharp and cold. You did. The days that followed felt like a blur. Ethan didn't leave, though a part of me wished he would. Instead, he walked around the house like a shadow, avoiding eye contact, his steps hesitant, as though he thought the floor might collapse beneath him. And maybe it would. I didn't know how to function with him there. Some days, I thought I could hold it together, shove everything into a box and pretend I was fine. Other days, I'd look at him and feel the sting of betrayal all over again. It wasn't just that he'd cheated. It was that he'd fallen for her. But the worst part? Somewhere, deep down, I still loved him. That realization was like a punch to the gut. How could I love someone who had torn my world apart? I confided in my best friend, Claire, one night over wine. She listened patiently, her brow furrowed as I recounted every detail, the texts, the photos, the confession. I hate him, I said finally, though even as the words left my lips, I wasn't sure if they were entirely true. Claire leaned back, crossing her arms. You don't hate him. That's the problem. I stared at my glass, swirling the wine absent-mindedly. What am I supposed to do, Claire? Kick him out? Pretend 3 years of my life didn't happen? That he didn't happen? You're supposed to put yourself first, she said firmly. For once. Look, I get it, you love him. But love doesn't mean letting someone walk all over you. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. Claire reached across the table, grabbing my hand. You are. You just don't see it yet. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Claire's words echoing in my mind. Put yourself first. When was the last time I'd done that? I'd spent so much of our marriage prioritizing Ethan, his needs, his happiness, his dreams. I'd built my life around him. And now, it felt like the foundation had been ripped away, leaving me scrambling to find my footing. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, stuck between heartbreak and denial. If Ethan wouldn't leave, I would. I packed a bag, not much, just enough for a week, and left a note on the kitchen counter. I didn't explain myself. I didn't owe him that much. All I wrote was, I need space. Don't call me. I drove to my parents' house, the very place where all of this had started. Pulling into the driveway felt strange, like stepping back into a version of myself I'd long since left behind. My mom opened the door before I even reached it, her eyes widening in surprise. Everything okay, sweetheart? She asked, concern lacing her voice. No, I admitted, and the single word broke something inside me. Before I knew it, I was crying, sobbing into her arms like I was a child again. She didn't press me for details, just held me until the storm passed. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a small sliver of relief. I wasn't alone. Over the next few days, I told her everything. She listened without judgment, though I could see the sadness in her eyes as I talked about Ethan and Mallory. You deserve better, she said simply when I finished. Do I? I asked, the doubt creeping in. Maybe I pushed him away. Maybe I... No, her voice was firm, and she reached across the table to grab my hand. Don't you dare blame yourself for his choices. Marriage isn't about perfection, honey. It's about loyalty. And he threw that away. Back in the city, Ethan was unraveling. I hadn't called or texted, and from what Claire told me, he was frantic. He's been asking if I've heard from you, she said during one of our phone calls. He's a mess. Good, I said, though the bitterness in my voice surprised even me. "Are you planning to go back?" she asked cautiously. I hesitated. "I don't know." The truth was, I didn't know if I could go back to the life I had before. But I wasn't ready to let go of it either. Ethan called the next day. I stared at the screen for what felt like forever, my heart pounding as his name flashed over and over. I didn't want to pick up. I didn't want to hear his excuses, his apologies, or the pathetic sound of his voice pleading for something he didn't deserve. But I answered anyway. "Where are you?" His voice cracked with worry. "I've been going out of my mind, Jess. Why didn't you tell me you were leaving?" I took a deep breath, holding the phone tightly. "I left a note, Ethan. I needed space." "Space," he repeated, like the word was foreign to him. "How am I supposed to fix this if you won't even talk to me?" "You don't fix something like this overnight," I snapped. "And you certainly don't fix it by trying to control the narrative." I needed time to think. Alone. His silence was heavy, laced with tension. "You could have told me where you were going." I was worried. "You don't get to worry about me," I said sharply. "Not anymore." Ethan didn't respond right away. I could hear him breathing, the faint rustling of fabric as he shifted. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost defeated. "I miss you." The words hit me like a blow, but I forced myself to stay strong. "You don't get to say that, Ethan. You don't get to miss me while you're in love with someone else." "I don't know what I feel," he admitted, and the raw honesty in his voice almost undid me. "I'm so messed up, Jess. I didn't want any of this to happen. I didn't mean for it to." "You didn't mean for it to happen?" I interrupted, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You didn't mean to fall in love with her? To sleep with her? To lie to me for 3 years? Those weren't accidents, Ethan. Those were choices." "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "And I hate myself for it." I closed my eyes, trying to steady the storm brewing inside me. "Maybe you should have thought of that before you destroyed our marriage." I ended the call before he could say anything else, tossing the phone onto the bed like it had burned me. My chest heaved, my pulse racing, and I felt like I was going to explode. The next few days were a blur of emotions. I spent hours walking the woods behind my parents' house, the same trails Ethan had walked with Mallory. Every step felt heavier, like the trees were watching me, holding pieces of the truth I was too afraid to uncover. My mom tried to help in her own quiet way. She didn't press me for answers or tell me what I should do. She just left cups of tea on the porch where I sat, staring into the distance, and let me come to her when I was ready. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, she joined me with her own cup of tea. We sat in silence for a while, the warm breeze carrying the faint scent of wildflowers. "When I was your age," she said suddenly, her voice soft, "I thought love was unshakable. Like it could survive anything, as long as it was real." I glanced at her, surprised. She rarely talked about her own past, especially not her marriage to my dad. "What changed?" She smiled faintly, a little sadly. "Life happened. Mistakes. Disappointments. But we made it through because we were honest with each other. We didn't let the cracks turn into fractures." Her words lingered in the air between us, and I felt tears pricking my eyes. "Do you think some fractures can't be fixed?" She hesitated, then reached over to take my hand. "I think it depends on what's left. If the foundation is still strong, you can rebuild. But if the foundation is broken," she shook her head, "you can't build anything on top of that." That night, I thought about our foundation, mine and Ethan's. When we were young and naive, we'd built it on trust and love, on laughter and late-night conversations about everything and nothing. But somewhere along the way, it had started to crack. And now, I wasn't sure if there was anything left to save. Ethan texted me a few days later. It was a long message, one I read and reread a dozen times before replying. He apologized again, said he was trying to figure out how to fix things, how to prove to me that he could be the man I deserved. "I just want to talk," he wrote. "Can we meet? Please." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We arranged to meet at a park near my parents' house, a quiet place where we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. When I saw him sitting on a bench, his head in his hands, my heart ached despite everything. He looked tired, his hair a little messier than usual, and there was a vulnerability in his posture that I hadn't seen before. "Jess." He stood as I approached, his eyes searching mine for some sign of forgiveness. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, sitting down on the opposite end of the bench. "You said you wanted to talk. So talk." Ethan took a deep breath, running his hands through his hair. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he began. "But I'm begging you to give me a chance to make things right. I'll do anything, Jess. Therapy, counseling, whatever you need. I can't lose you." I studied him, trying to read between the lines of his desperation. "What about Mallory?" He flinched, and for a moment, I thought he might lie. But then he said, "I haven't seen her since I told you the truth." "And do you still love her?" I pressed. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I don't know." The words hung in the air like a death knell. My chest tightened, and I felt the tears welling up, but I refused to let them fall. "Then how can you ask me to stay? How can you ask me to put my heart on the line when you don't even know if you want it?" "Because I love you," he said desperately, reaching for my hand. "I love you, Jess. I made a mistake, a terrible, stupid mistake. But you're my wife. You're the one I want to be with." I pulled my hand away, shaking my head. "Love isn't enough, Ethan. Not anymore." I walked away from him that day. Not angrily, not dramatically. Just quietly, like something inside me had finally accepted what my heart was refusing to let go of. I left him sitting on that park bench, staring after me, his mouth half open like he wanted to call out, but didn't know what to say. The thing is, I knew Ethan loved me. Somewhere in that mess of guilt and confusion, he did. But love wasn't a tether strong enough to hold us together anymore. He didn't just betray me, he betrayed us, the life we built, the promises we made. And I couldn't figure out how to come back from that. Back at my parents' house, I poured all my energy into tasks that didn't require much thought. I helped my mom with her garden, cooked dinners with her, played cards with my dad in the evenings. Simple things that kept my hands busy and my mind quiet. But at night, when the house was still and I was alone with my thoughts, the weight of it all crept back in. I'd lie awake in bed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, replaying every moment of my marriage, trying to pinpoint the exact moment it began to fall apart. Had I been blind? Or had Ethan been that good at hiding it? A week passed before I heard from him again. This time, it was an email, a long, rambling letter that felt more like a plea than anything else. He told me he was starting therapy, that he was trying to figure out why he let himself ruin the best thing in his life. He said he'd cut ties with Mallory, that he was willing to move mountains if it meant earning back my trust. "I know I don't deserve you," he wrote. "But I'm not ready to give up on us." I read the email twice before closing my laptop and walking away. His words felt heavy, tangled in guilt and regret, but I didn't know if they were enough to rebuild what he'd broken. 2 days later, Mallory called me. When I saw her name flash across my phone screen, I froze. My hand started shaking, and for a moment, I thought about letting it go to voicemail. But some part of me, the part that wanted answers, closure, picked up. "Hello?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. "Jess." Her voice was soft, almost tentative. "I'm sorry for calling you. I needed to talk to you." I swallowed the lump in my throat, my grip tightening on the phone. "Why?" "Because you deserve to hear the truth," she said simply. "And because Ethan won't tell you all of it." I sank into the couch, my knees suddenly weak. "What truth?" There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear her take a shaky breath. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't plan to hurt you. But Ethan, he came to me first. He told me things, about your marriage, about how distant you'd been. He made it seem like he was already halfway out the door. I clenched my jaw, my teeth grinding together. And that made it okay? For you to sleep with him? To tear apart someone else's marriage? No, she said quickly. No, it didn't. I know that now. God, Jess, I'm not trying to excuse what I did. I just want you to know that he wasn't some innocent victim in this. He made choices. We both did. Are you still in love with him? The question flew out of my mouth before I could stop it. There was another long pause, and then she said, I don't know. But I think I'll always care about him. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to stay calm. Well, I hope caring about him was worth destroying a marriage. Mallory didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was quieter, almost pleading. I'm sorry, Jess. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am. I hung up without saying goodbye. That conversation sat heavy with me for days. Her words, her tone, it all felt so deliberate, like she was trying to absolve herself of guilt by sharing it with me. But all it did was solidify the cracks Ethan had tried so hard to patch over. He hadn't just been passive in all of this. He'd sought her out, confided in her, painted a picture of our marriage that gave her permission to step in. It was like a betrayal on top of a betrayal. A week later, I returned home. The house felt colder, emptier than it had before. Ethan was there, sitting on the couch like he'd been waiting for me. His eyes lit up when he saw me, but the moment he noticed the guarded expression on my face, the hope flickered and died. You're back, he said quietly, standing up. For now, I replied, crossing my arms. We need to talk. He nodded, gesturing for me to sit, but I stayed where I was. I talked to Mallory, I said, watching as his face paled. What did she say? He stammered. Enough, I said. Enough to know that you weren't just some lost, confused husband who got swept up in something. You made a choice, Ethan. You chased her. You built something with her, and you let it chip away at everything we had. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his hands twitching at his sides. I'm sorry, he said finally. I'm so sorry, Jess. I know, I said, my voice soft. But sorry isn't enough. For the first time, I saw the full weight of his regret settle on his shoulders. He sank back onto the couch, his head in his hands, and I felt a pang of sadness for the man I used to know, the one who would have fought for me, not against me. I'm not sure what happens next, I admitted, my voice trembling. But I know I can't keep living like this. The days after my return blurred together. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do next, only that something had to change. Ethan stayed in the guest room, moving around the house like a ghost. He didn't push, didn't try to force conversations. He gave me space, though the weight of his presence was still suffocating. We didn't talk much, but the silence spoke volumes. It was heavy with things unsaid, emotions neither of us could name. I wasn't ready to confront the future, but I knew I couldn't stay in the limbo we'd created. One night, a few weeks after I returned, I sat on the living room couch with a glass of wine, staring at the wedding photo we'd hung on the wall all those years ago. Ethan had just come back from work, and I heard his footsteps pause in the hallway when he saw me. You can come in, I said softly, not turning around. He hesitated before stepping into the room, sitting down in the armchair across from me. I could feel his eyes on me, waiting, but I didn't look at him. I think we need to talk, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded. I've been waiting for you to say that. I finally looked at him, taking in the man I'd once thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. He looked older somehow, the weight of the past few months etched into the lines on his face. I've been trying to figure out how to move forward, I began, clutching the wine glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. But every time I think about what you did, it's like I'm stuck in the same place. I know, he said, his voice filled with regret. I know I broke us, Jess. And I'll never forgive myself for that. It's not just about forgiveness, I said, shaking my head. It's about trust. About respect. And I don't know if we can ever get that back. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I'll do anything, Jess. Therapy, counseling, whatever you need. I want to fix this. I want to fix us. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Do you even hear yourself, Ethan? You're still talking about what you want. But what about me? What about what I need? His eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked genuinely stunned. What do you need? He asked softly. I need to heal, I said, my voice cracking. And I can't do that with you here. The words hung in the air between us, and I saw the realization dawn on his face. You're asking me to leave. I'm asking for space, I said, though even as the words left my lips, I knew they didn't do justice to the magnitude of what I was saying. We can't keep pretending this is going to work, Ethan. Not right now. He leaned back in the chair, his face pale. Where am I supposed to go? I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed it aside. I don't know. Maybe back to your parents' house for a while. But I need you to go. I need to figure out who I am without you. The next few days were tense and quiet. Ethan began packing his things, moving methodically through the house like he was trying to memorize every detail. He didn't say much, and I didn't press him. There wasn't much left to say. The night before he left, he knocked on my bedroom door. I opened it to find him standing there, looking like the boy I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, vulnerable, uncertain, and so very human. I don't want to go, he said softly. But I know I need to. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I think this is the best thing for both of us. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his wedding ring. I've been wearing it, he admitted. Even after everything. I don't know why. I guess I wasn't ready to let go. I stared at the ring, my heart aching. Neither was I whispered. He placed the ring on the dresser beside me, his fingers lingering on it for a moment before he stepped back. For what it's worth, Jess. I really did love you. I still do. I felt the tears welling up, but I forced myself to hold them back. I know, I said. I just wish love had been enough. He nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Goodbye, Jess. Goodbye, Ethan. When the door closed behind him the next morning, I felt a strange mix of relief and grief. The house was finally quiet, but it also felt unbearably empty. For years, Ethan had been the center of my world. And now, I had to figure out how to rebuild a life without him in it. The following weeks were both freeing and agonizing. I threw myself into work, spent more time with friends, and even joined a yoga class that Claire had been begging me to try for months. Slowly but surely, I began to rediscover pieces of myself that I'd forgotten existed. But at night, when the house was silent and the weight of the day settled over me, I still felt his absence like a wound that hadn't quite healed. I missed the way he used to make me laugh, the way he'd reach for my hand during movies, the way he'd whisper, "I love you," before falling asleep. One evening, as I sat on the couch with a cup of tea, my phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. It was short and simple. I hope you're doing okay. I miss you. I stared at the message, my heart aching. But instead of replying, I set the phone down and looked out the window at the fading sunlight. For the first time in months, I felt a small, tentative spark of hope, not for us, but for me. The first days after Ethan left felt surreal, like I was floating through a life I didn't recognize. I moved from room to room, noticing the little reminders of him that lingered, his favorite mug in the cupboard, the dent in the couch where he always sat, the faint smell of his cologne on the jacket he left behind. At first, I couldn't bring myself to touch any of it. But slowly, I started reclaiming the space as mine. I packed up the jacket and his other forgotten belongings, stashing them in a box in the garage. I rearranged the living room, bought a new bedspread, and hung up art that I'd always liked but never thought Ethan would appreciate. It was small, but it felt like a step toward something, toward me. Claire, as always, was my rock. She dragged me out of the house on weekends, insisting we go to brunch or to the farmer's market or anywhere that would get me out of my head. She didn't push me to talk about Ethan unless I wanted to, which I appreciated more than she probably realized. One Saturday, as we sat in a bustling cafe, she asked, "Have you thought about what's next?" I stirred my coffee, avoiding her gaze. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said carefully, "have you thought about whether you want to try to work things out with Ethan, or if you're ready to let go?" The question sat heavy between us. I stared out the window, watching a couple laugh as they shared a croissant, their hands brushing as they reached for the same piece. My chest tightened. "I don't know," I admitted. "I thought I'd have more clarity by now, but it's all still messy." Claire reached across the table, giving my hand a reassuring squeeze. "It's okay if you're not ready to decide. Just don't let the indecision paralyze you. You deserve to move forward, Jess, whatever that looks like." That night, I sat in bed scrolling through old photos on my phone. There we were, smiling on our honeymoon, sunburned and happy after a long day at the beach. There was Ethan holding our first Christmas tree, grinning as I snapped the picture. There was me, laughing as he tried to teach me how to barbecue without burning everything. We'd been happy once. Truly, deeply happy. But somewhere along the way, we'd stopped laughing. The weight of life, work, bills, responsibilities, had pressed down on us, and instead of leaning into each other, Ethan had leaned into someone else. It hurt to admit it, but I wasn't blameless. I'd let the distance grow, too busy with my career to notice the cracks forming in our marriage. I'd assumed the foundation was strong enough to withstand anything. I never imagined it could crumble so completely. 2 weeks later, I received an email from Ethan. He'd written me a few times since he left, but this one felt different. It was longer, more vulnerable, and it wasn't just about apologizing. It was about reflection. "I've been going to therapy," he wrote. "I'm learning a lot about myself, things I didn't want to see before. Like how I always needed validation, how I let my insecurities get the better of me, and how I blamed you for things that weren't your fault. I've spent so much time focusing on what I wasn't getting that I never stopped to ask what I wasn't giving." I read his words slowly, carefully, feeling the sincerity behind them. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, wasn't begging for another chance. He was just being honest. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something. Not hope, exactly, but maybe a sense of possibility. I decided to call him. Not because I was ready to forgive him or because I wanted to rekindle what we'd lost, but because I wanted to hear his voice. I wanted to see if the man I'd loved was still in there somewhere. When he picked up, his voice was hesitant. "Jess?" "Hey," I said, my own voice softer than I expected. "I got your email." "Oh." He sounded surprised. "I wasn't sure if you'd read it." "I did," I said. "Anne. I appreciate it. I can tell you've been doing a lot of thinking." "I have," he said earnestly. "And I know it doesn't erase what I did, but I'm trying to be better. For you, for me, for whoever I become after all this." I let his words sink in, then asked, "Do you still talk to her?" "No," he said immediately. "I cut ties with Mallory after you left. I haven't spoken to her since." The relief I felt was unexpected, though I wasn't sure why it mattered. "Good," I said simply. There was a pause, and then he asked, "Do you think we could talk sometime? In person, I mean." I hesitated, my heart racing. "I don't know, Ethan. I'm still figuring things out." "I get it," he said quickly. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here, Jess. No matter what you decide." After that call, something shifted. I still didn't know if I could ever forgive Ethan, let alone rebuild our marriage. But for the first time, I felt like I was beginning to heal. Not because of him, but because I was finally starting to see my own strength. After that call with Ethan, I realized something important. I didn't have to decide anything yet. For months, I'd felt trapped between two choices, trying to rebuild what we had or walking away for good. But what if I didn't have to pick right now? What if this time was meant for me? That small shift in perspective was freeing. I stopped obsessing over what if and started focusing on the present, on rediscovering myself, on figuring out what I wanted, not just what I thought I should want. The first step was therapy. Claire had been nudging me toward it for weeks, and I finally gave in. My therapist, Laura, was calm and kind, with a way of asking questions that cut through the noise in my head. "Tell me about your marriage," she said in our first session. "What did it feel like when it was good?" I hesitated, thinking back to those early years. "It felt effortless," I said finally. "Like we were a team. We laughed a lot. We supported each other. And it wasn't perfect, but it was solid." "And when did that change?" she asked. I stared at the ceiling, my chest tightening. "I don't know. It wasn't sudden. It was little things, I guess. We stopped talking as much. We got busy. And then one day, I realized I didn't know who we were anymore." She nodded, jotting something down. "Do you think you stopped prioritizing each other?" "Maybe," I admitted. "But I thought that was normal, you know? Life gets busy. I thought we'd figure it out eventually." "Did you ever talk about it with him?" I shook my head. I didn't think I needed to. I thought we were okay. She gave me a small, understanding smile. "It sounds like there was a lot left unsaid." Her words stayed with me long after the session ended. She was right. I'd assumed Ethan and I were strong enough to weather anything, but I'd never stopped to check the cracks forming beneath the surface. And by the time I noticed, it was too late. A few weeks later, I went out for dinner with Claire and some friends from work. It was the first time in months that I felt like myself again, laughing, joking, and not carrying the weight of my marriage like an invisible anchor. At one point, Claire leaned over and whispered, "You're glowing, you know." I laughed, brushing her off. "I'm just happy to be out of the house." "No, it's more than that," she said, smiling. "You're finding yourself again. And it looks good on you." Her words warmed me in a way I hadn't expected. For so long, I'd felt like a shell of the person I used to be. But slowly, I was starting to feel whole again. Ethan and I spoke occasionally over the next month, mostly through text. He updated me on his therapy progress, shared small victories like getting promoted at work, and once, he sent a picture of the first meal he cooked entirely on his own. "It didn't taste great," he admitted, "but I didn't burn the kitchen down, so that's a win." His messages were light, almost friendly, and I found myself appreciating the effort he was making, not just to connect with me, but to grow as a person. Still, I kept my boundaries firm. I didn't let the conversation stray into emotional territory, and I didn't make any promises about the future. One Saturday morning, I drove back to the town where it all began, the place where Ethan had gone on those trips to visit my parents, where Mallory had slipped into our lives. I hadn't been there since everything unraveled, and the thought of it made my stomach twist. But I knew I needed closure. Walking through the town square felt surreal. Everything looked the same: the diner where Ethan and I used to have breakfast, the park where we'd once picnicked on lazy summer afternoons. And yet, it all felt different. Like I was seeing it through a lens I hadn't realized I'd been wearing. I ended up at the cafe where Mallory worked part-time. I hadn't planned to go there, it just happened. When I walked in, she was behind the counter, laughing at something a customer said. She didn't notice me right away, and for a moment, I considered turning around and leaving. But then she spotted me. Her smile faltered, her eyes widening in recognition. "Jess," she said softly. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "Hi, Mallory." She looked nervous, like she wasn't sure what to say. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." I wasn't expecting to come here, I admitted. But I needed to. I don't know. See for myself. See what? She asked, her voice hesitant. I hesitated, then said, why? She exhaled, her shoulders slumping slightly. It wasn't about you, Jess. It never was. Ethan, he was lost. And she stopped, shaking her head. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know that doesn't make it better, but it's the truth. I studied her for a long moment, trying to read between the lines. She seemed genuine, but it didn't matter. Her reasons didn't change what had happened. Maybe it wasn't about me, I said finally. But it happened to me. To us. And you played a part in that. She nodded, her expression somber. I know. And I'm sorry. I didn't respond. There was nothing else to say. I turned and walked out, the sound of the door closing behind me strangely satisfying. For the first time in months, I felt a sliver of peace. That night, I called Ethan. When he picked up, he sounded surprised. Jess? I went back to the town, I said, skipping the pleasantries. He was silent for a moment, then asked, why? I needed closure, I said simply. And I think I found it. What does that mean? His voice was careful, unsure. It means I'm ready to move forward, I said. But not with us, Ethan. Not right now. His breath hitched, and I could hear the hurt in his silence. I understand, he said softly. Thank you, I said, my voice trembling. For trying. For being honest. But I need to do this for me. The days after that call were some of the hardest I'd ever experienced. Even though I knew I'd made the right decision, there were moments I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Letting Ethan go wasn't just about ending a relationship, it was about mourning the life we'd built together, the dreams we'd once shared. But with every passing day, I felt a little lighter. I poured my energy into rebuilding my life, one step, one breath at a time. I signed up for an art class, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. I started running again, finding solace in the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement. And slowly, I began to see glimpses of the woman I used to be, the woman I was becoming again. Ethan kept his distance. We exchanged a few texts here and there, mostly about logistics, finalizing bills, dividing up belongings. He respected my boundaries, and for that, I was grateful. One day, I came home to find a small box on the porch. It was from Ethan. Inside was a handwritten note and a few items he thought I'd want back, a pair of earrings I'd forgotten at his apartment, a book I'd loaned him years ago. The note was short but heartfelt. Jess. Thank you for giving me the chance to grow, even if it meant losing you. I'll always be grateful for the time we had, and I hope you find the happiness you deserve. Ethan. I held the note in my hands, tears slipping down my cheeks. It was bittersweet, a reminder of what we'd lost, but also of how far we'd come. A few weeks later, I woke up to a clear, sunny morning. It was one of those rare days when everything felt light and possible, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something new to begin. I decided to take a walk through the neighborhood, soaking in the crisp air and the warmth of the sun on my face. As I passed the small bookstore on the corner, I noticed a sign in the window, Open Mic Night, this Friday. I'd walked past that sign countless times, always telling myself I'd go someday. But someday had never come. That night, I texted Claire. Open Mic Night Friday. You in? Her response came almost immediately. You bet your ass I am. Friday arrived, and the bookstore was buzzing with energy. Claire and I squeezed into a table near the back, surrounded by shelves of well-worn books and string lights that cast a warm glow over the room. One by one, people took the stage, reading poems, singing songs, sharing stories. Some were polished, others raw and unfiltered, but all of them felt real. As I watched, I felt a strange sense of kinship with these strangers, each of them putting pieces of themselves on display. They weren't afraid to be vulnerable, to let the cracks in their armor show. And in that moment, I realized I didn't have to be afraid either. The next day, I sat down with my journal, the one I'd been too scared to open for months. At first, the words came slowly, hesitantly. But as I wrote, the floodgates opened. I poured everything onto the page, the heartbreak, the anger, the guilt, the hope. By the time I finished, the sun had set, and I felt like I'd shed a layer of skin. It wasn't a magic fix. It didn't erase the pain or the memories. But it was a start. One evening, I got a call from my mom. "How are you, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice warm and familiar. "I'm okay," I said, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it. We talked for a while, catching up on the little things, her garden, my dad's new hobby of woodworking. And then, just as we were about to hang up, she said something that stayed with me. "You know, Jess," she said gently, "sometimes the hardest thing isn't letting go of someone. It's forgiving yourself." I didn't respond right away, her words settling over me like a blanket. "I think I'm working on that," I said finally. Over time, the ache in my chest began to dull. It didn't disappear completely, some wounds don't, but it stopped defining me. I started to see my life not as something that had been broken, but as something that could be rebuilt. Ethan was a part of my story, a chapter I'd carry with me forever. But he wasn't the whole book. And as I stood at the edge of this new chapter, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Months passed, and the seasons began to change. Winter melted into spring, and with it came a sense of renewal I hadn't expected. The world around me seemed alive again, flowers blooming, birds returning, and the days stretching longer with each passing sunset. For the first time in what felt like forever, I started to feel alive too. I'd carved out a life for myself, one that felt both familiar and brand new. My days were filled with little joys, quiet mornings with coffee and a book, long walks with Claire, hours spent in my art class, getting my hands messy with clay and paint. They weren't grand moments, but they were mine, and that was enough. One morning, as I sat on the porch of my parents' house during a weekend visit, my dad joined me. He handed me a cup of tea and settled into the chair next to mine. "You seem different," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Different how?" I asked, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Lighter. Happier." I thought about his words, letting them sink in. "I think I am," I admitted. "I'm not there yet, but I'm getting closer." He nodded, a proud look on his face. "You've always been stronger than you give yourself credit for." Hearing him say that felt like a balm to my soul. For so long, I'd felt weak, broken. But maybe strength wasn't about never breaking. Maybe it was about putting yourself back together, piece by piece, and learning to stand on your own again. Ethan reached out one final time that spring. I was at work when his name popped up on my phone, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But something told me to pick up. "Hi, Jess," he said, his voice careful, as though he wasn't sure I'd even want to hear from him. "Hi, Ethan," I replied, my tone neutral. "I just wanted to check in," he said. "See how you're doing." "I'm doing well," I said honestly. "How about you?" "I'm okay," he said after a pause. "Still going to therapy. Still trying to figure myself out." "That's good," I said. And I meant it. There was a brief silence, and then he said, "I wanted to thank you. For everything. For being patient with me, for being honest, for letting me go when I needed to figure myself out." His words caught me off guard, but they didn't hurt the way they once would have. "Thank you, too," I said softly. "For trying. For giving me the space to heal." We said our goodbyes, and when I hung up, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. The pain wasn't gone, it probably never would be, but it no longer controlled me. I'd forgiven Ethan, and more importantly, I'd forgiven myself. A few weeks later, Claire convinced me to go to a gallery opening downtown. I was hesitant at first, but the energy of the event was infectious. The room was filled with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of conversation. I wandered through the space, taking in the art, bold, vibrant pieces that felt like they were telling their own stories. As I stood in front of one particularly striking painting, a swirling mix of blues and golds, a voice behind me said, "Beautiful, isn't it?" I turned to see a man about my age, his hands tucked into his pockets. He had kind eyes and an easy smile, the kind that made you feel at ease even in a room full of strangers. "It is," I said, nodding. "There's something hopeful about it." He smiled, stepping closer. "I think so, too. Like it's not afraid to be messy and bold at the same time." We talked for a while, drifting from one piece to the next. His name was Ryan, and he was an artist himself, though he claimed he wasn't as talented as the ones on display. I wasn't sure if I believed him, but his humility was endearing. As the night went on, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, curiosity. About him, about what might come next, about the possibilities I'd closed myself off to for so long. We exchanged numbers at the end of the night, and as I walked home, I found myself smiling. It wasn't a promise, wasn't anything more than a tentative step forward. But it felt good, hopeful. Looking back, I realized something important: healing isn't linear. It's messy and complicated, filled with setbacks and breakthroughs, moments of clarity and days of doubt. But it's also beautiful in its own way, a process of rediscovering who you are, of finding strength in the places you thought were broken. Ethan was part of my story, but he wasn't the ending. And as I stood on the cusp of this new chapter, I felt ready to embrace whatever came next. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't defined by my past. I was defined by the person I was becoming.